The outhouse also sat on the back of the property. The drainage ditch kept the ground green and created the only green spot in our entire lot. It was small. The house was small with a kitchen and a living room. The heat was pot-bellied stove in the living room and a wood cook stove in the kitchen. My parents and sisters slept in the living room, while once again my brothers and I slept in the garage, next to the cow pen. Now this garage was not nearly as good as the last one. There was no windows and a dirt floor. The door had cracks you could see through, and the walls were boards nailed on 2x4s. When you stop to think about it, it surely was not a building to be in during a sandstorm. My parents covered our bed with the canvas and gave us the moist towels before each storm. They did the best they could with what they had. 2 or 3 years later, my dad started building on a large bedroom for all of us to sleep in. Most of the time, that fine dust would be so thick I could not see my brothers, I could only touch them. I guess you know most of the time we slept with that tarp pulled up over our heads. The garage was also very cold, and the tarp was a good warm cover. Now the outhouse was in back of the barn, but some nights you didn't need a light to find it. Although we were just inside the city limits, we had a cow, some chickens, and 3 pigs. 3 or 4 pigs. At night, when we went to bed, I'm not sure which smelled worse, the outhouse or the animal pen. The outhouse had to be moved periodically, so later we moved farther. It was moved farther from the house. The house had a deck on the back, and that's where my mother did her laundry. She had an old Maytag washing machine with a manual wringer. I often had to crank that thing. Now I pause here to show this picture of the back of the house with Mom and Dad and my 2 little brothers, Leroy and Chuck, or Tuppy as he was called then. I believe it was 1936 or early 37. As you can see, we always took our pictures in the green area near the septic tank and the drainage ditch, for it was the only green spot. Now note the ground around and near the house is that old hard clay left from those harsh storms. You see the deck on the back of the house, also the old Maytag washing machine near the door. I don't have any pictures of the barn or the new building we used for bedrooms. Another daily job of mine was to make sure that the box we kept the firewood in was always full. When my brothers were older, they had to help me fill it. We also had to chop and bring in wood for the pot-bellied stove in the living room. All this may sound primitive, but there was no other form of heat except natural gas, and it was not piped into this part of town until some years later. We had electricity, which I gather was quite expensive because remember my dad would put copper pennies behind the fuses in the meter box so it would not register all the power that we used. He had to be sure to take those pennies out before the meter man came each month. My parents paid $500 for that house. I remember the payment was $5 a month, and they would pin the money inside my coat, and I would walk across town to make the payment. Growing up in this time, I didn't think we were so poor because most everybody else was poor also. It's a little hard to imagine ever living with and having so little when I see how we live now. We were not the only kids to sleep away from the main house. Everyone had sand piles in the yard, and everyone had to sweep and shovel sand from the house after a sandstorm. I have always called them sandstorms, but they were really dust storms. Families would put sheets over their windows and doors, nailing strips of wood to hold the sheets tight against the wall. My parents may also put covers over the windows, but I can't remember any sheets. We probably didn't have any extra. We had what my mom called muslin sheets, which was a thin blanket type. They were warmer than sheets. The years passed and the sand kept blowing more and more. All the ground around our house had long become hard, uneven clay like we had on that lot next to our first house in town, except for that little green spot where the septic tank drained through the backyard. There was no lawn, just a row of willows and a good crop of weeds. There were 2 city blocks across from our house that were undeveloped. They were covered with weeds and clumps of Johnson grass. The Johnson grass was the size of a football, and the wind did not seem to blow them out as much as it did other things. They had a good root base, I guess. The sandstorms would deposit sand against those weeds and clumps of grass so bad you could barely see the tops. Then another storm would come along and blow away that sand, exposing the plants. Sand would fill the drainage ditches that ran along one side of each street and then come and carry it away. Some of the streets where houses were close together was covered with so much sand it was like walking on the beach. We got used to all these changes and just coped with it. We couldn't afford hay for the cow, just a little grain at milking time. To give her some green fodder, I had to take her out on those vacant lots and put her on a long chain attached to an iron stake that I drove into the ground. I moved the stake each day as picking was meager. This was my chore each day before school, and when I came home for lunch, I had to bring her in for a drink of water, then back on the chain. In the summertime, the only time I was allowed to wear shoes was when I staked the cow. I had to wear shoes on those lots because along with the weeds and the Johnson grass, there was a crawling vine with stickers. We called them goat heads, for they were shaped like a goat head with horns. Those things hurt like bee stings. Your foot was sore for hours. And if you got if you got too many in your foot would swell up. Along with those hazards was the cow herself. One cow we had for a long time was a big black cow with 8 or 9 inch horns. She was mean and was always trying to butt or hook me with those horns. My dad had to hobble her when he milked her. Now that cow did not like me, nor did I like her. I was a little afraid of her, and I think she knew it. I was always watchful of her, except this one time. I was in a hurry to go play with some friends, and I went out barefooted and stepped on a goat head. While I was bent over trying to remove it from my foot, she jumped me and hooked her horn in the side of my overall bib and threw me several feet away. I had an awful bruise on my rib cage for some time. I got up and took that iron stake and whacked her several times on the head and the neck. That was a mistake, for my dad just happened to see what happened and kicked my butt for hitting the old cow. He said it was my fault for not watching her. And on top of that, he said I couldn't go play.